The world was once thriving with the hum of life, but now, it lay silent, haunted by the ghosts of its former self. A nation that had been proud, powerful, and ever dominant was no more. America, a land of liberty and hope, had been reduced to a crumbling wasteland, overrun by the relentless undead. The skies were heavy with gray clouds, a permanent shroud of decay over the land, as survivors huddled in scattered pockets of resistance. Jacob Harris, one of the last remaining warriors of the human race, stared out over the broken remnants of what had once been the bustling streets of New York City. The ruins, now a desolate landscape, were a stark reminder of everything that had been lost. Skyscrapers that once towered above the skyline now stood as hollowed-out shells, and the streets, once teeming with life, were littered with the remains of those who had fallen victim to the zombie plague. His weapon, an old, weathered rifle, felt heavy in his hands as he surveyed the surroundings, his senses sharp as ever. His team was out there, spread out across different parts of the city, holding the line against the undead horde that had taken over every corner of the nation. Jacob was part of a small group of survivors, men and women who had fought tooth and nail for every scrap of survival, pushing back the darkness with all the strength they had left. The battle for survival had reached a new level of desperation. The undead had not only overtaken cities but had begun to spread out into the vast wilderness, making every place a dangerous haven for those foolish enough to venture beyond their barricades. Jacob's mission was simple: survive, and protect the ones he could. But survival had become a battle of attrition. The undead didn't stop, they never tired, and they never seemed to lose their hunger for flesh. But Jacob had seen the worst of it. He had been a soldier before the world fell apart, part of a military elite tasked with handling crises. But now, the only thing that remained of his military training was his instinct to survive. He had lost count of the friends and family he had buried. The faces of the fallen haunted him in his sleep, and the fire of revenge burned deep within his chest. He was no longer the man he once was, but the warrior who would do anything to protect what little remained of humanity. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a soft scraping sound followed by the unmistakable shuffle of dead feet. Jacob's grip on his rifle tightened, his heart skipping a beat as his training kicked in. The sound was coming from the alleyway ahead, where darkness still clung to the remnants of the city's infrastructure. The undead were close, but Jacob had long ago learned to rely on his senses. He scanned the area, his eyes narrowing, searching for any sign of movement. Without hesitation, he crouched low, moving silently toward the alley, each step calculated. His mind raced with the knowledge that every encounter could be his last. The undead were relentless, but there was something different about this particular group. As he peered around the corner, Jacob saw them, the slow-moving walkers, their eyes glazed and lifeless, but something about the way they were gathered made his stomach twist. They weren't the usual disorganized horde. They were drawn together in a formation, as if they were being led by something, or someone. Just then, a soft voice crackled through his earpiece. "Jacob, report in. What's your status?" It was Sarah, his trusted teammate and one of the few he trusted with his life. "I've got a group of them. They're acting differently." "There's something going on here," Jacob replied, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his mind. Sarah's voice came through again, urgent this time. "Don't engage unless necessary. We're picking up movement on the east side of the city. We need to get out of here and regroup. It's getting worse." Jacob hesitated. He could hear the underlying panic in Sarah's voice, but something was drawing him in. He couldn't just leave. Not when he could still make a difference. He had to understand what was going on. The undead had changed in ways that didn't make sense, and Jacob couldn't afford to let this mystery slip by. If there was a pattern or a weakness, he needed to find it, before it was too late for everyone. As the sounds of the undead grew louder, Jacob knew his time was running out. He had to act fast. His fingers wrapped tightly around the rifle's trigger, and with a deep breath, he took his first steps into the darkness, moving toward the horde. There was no turning back now. In this world, answers and survival came at a price. Jacob moved silently through the shadows of the abandoned city, his breath shallow and his senses on high alert. The undead were all around him, but their movements weren't random. They were clustered together, forming an unnatural pattern that gnawed at his mind. Why were they acting like this? Normally, the zombies roamed aimlessly, but tonight, they seemed to have purpose, an eerie intelligence behind their actions. He pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of a nearby building, listening intently to the groaning and dragging sounds coming from the alley. There were at least a dozen of them, some stumbling, others moving in coordinated patterns. The thought sent a chill down his spine. The instinct of the undead was to devour, but this was different. Jacob's mind raced as he formulated a plan. It was dangerous to engage, his team was still scattered, and he was alone in enemy territory. But the need to understand what was happening here consumed him. Something was changing in the world of the undead, and Jacob couldn't afford to ignore it. Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece again, her tone more insistent this time. "Jacob, are you listening? You need to fall back, now. I'm serious, we've got intel on a major movement to the north. If you don't pull back, you're gonna be surrounded." Jacob hesitated. "I'm aware. I've got a situation here. I'm not sure what it is, but these zombies are acting differently. I can't just leave yet, Sarah. I need to know what's going on." There was a long pause on the other end before Sarah responded. "I get it. Just don't do anything reckless. We'll be there in 20 minutes. Hang tight." Jacob didn't respond. He couldn't afford distractions, not with the stakes this high. He checked his rifle once more, ensuring it was ready for whatever came next. The horde in front of him wasn't moving with the mindless hunger of typical zombies. They were circling something he couldn't see. His eyes narrowed. If they were gathering around something, then it was more than just a random attack. Slowly, Jacob advanced, keeping low to the ground and sticking to the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest as the undead shuffled closer. They were just a few feet away now, and he could make out their decaying features in the dim light. Their eyes were glazed, their skin mottled and stretched, but they were strangely synchronized. It was almost like they were waiting. As Jacob inched closer, he heard the faint sound of a voice, soft and almost imperceptible beneath the groans of the undead. His heart skipped. He wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was controlling this group. Without a moment's hesitation, Jacob pressed his back against a nearby dumpster, silently lifting his head to get a better view of the alleyway. His eyes scanned the surroundings, and that's when he saw it, a figure, cloaked in shadows, standing at the center of the horde. The undead had gathered around this figure, like mindless soldiers awaiting orders. Jacob's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. The figure appeared to be human, but it was hard to tell in the dim light. Could it be someone alive? A survivor? Or worse, could it be something more sinister, one of the infected who had somehow retained its intelligence? The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as the zombies around it shifted in response. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The undead weren't mindlessly attacking. They were following commands. This was a new development, something Jacob had never encountered before. The idea that the infected could adapt, learn, and organize was terrifying. Before Jacob could gather his thoughts, the figure turned, locking eyes with him for just a brief moment. There was an unsettling sense of awareness in its gaze, as if it had known he was watching. It was a moment that felt like an eternity, as if time had frozen. Then, without warning, the figure raised its hand, and the zombies surrounding it began to shift, slowly moving toward Jacob's position. His heart raced as he realized the danger he was in. The undead weren't the mindless creatures he had once known. They were evolving. They were adapting. And that meant Jacob was no longer facing a simple horde. He was facing something far worse. A surge of adrenaline coursed through his veins, and Jacob knew it was time to act. He couldn't afford to let the zombies surround him. With a swift motion, he ducked behind a nearby stack of crates, his rifle aimed and ready. "Sarah, it's worse than I thought," Jacob whispered into his earpiece, his voice low and urgent. "The undead are evolving. There's a leader, and they're following it. I don't know what's going on, but we need to move fast. Get to my location, now. Jacob, listen to me, Sarah's voice came through, frantic. This is what we've been tracking. You're not alone in this. We've encountered similar movements elsewhere. We think there's someone, or something, behind this. You have to hold on, we're almost there. But Jacob knew. They weren't just up against the undead anymore. They were up against something far more dangerous, something that could control the zombies. And if that was true, then the world as they knew it had just become a far darker place. With no time to lose, Jacob crouched lower, bracing himself for the inevitable. The undead were closing in. It was time to fight, and it was time to survive. But survival now meant understanding the enemy in ways they hadn't imagined. And Jacob was about to learn just how deep the darkness went. Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle as the horde closed in, the eerie silence broken only by the scraping of decaying feet and the occasional guttural moan. The figure at the center of the group moved with purpose, its eyes scanning the area like a predator sensing prey. Jacob's stomach twisted. This was no ordinary zombie, there was an intelligence behind its movements, and that intelligence was guiding the entire horde. He held his breath as the figure turned, its eyes narrowing in his direction once more. For a moment, Jacob could feel the weight of its gaze, as if the creature was studying him, assessing him. It didn't make sense. Zombies weren't supposed to think or strategize. They were supposed to be mindless, relentless machines driven only by hunger. But this was different. The figure raised its hand again, and the undead around it halted, their movements synchronized like a well-trained army. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as the leader, if that's what it was, turned to face the rest of the horde. With another subtle gesture, the zombies began to spread out, moving with a strange sense of order, forming a perimeter around the alleyway. Jacob's mind raced. Was this some sort of advanced mutation? Could the infected be evolving, gaining the ability to lead, to organize? The questions swirled in his head, but there was no time to ponder. He had to act. If he didn't, he'd be surrounded, and the last thing he wanted was to become another nameless victim in the undead's insatiable hunger. Sarah, do you copy? He whispered urgently into his earpiece. I'm here, Jacob. What's going on? You sound. I'm not sure how much time we have. There's something here, something that's controlling the undead. A leader, maybe. These zombies, they're acting with purpose. I need to get out of here. Sarah's voice crackled with tension. You're not alone. We're coming. Just hold tight. Jacob didn't have time to wait. He could hear the sound of the undead closing in on him, their growls growing louder as they spread out. With a quick motion, he pressed his back against the wall, slowly inching toward the far end of the alley, trying to stay out of sight. The figure, the leader, was still watching him, its movements unnaturally calm amidst the chaos. Jacob could almost feel its awareness, like it was waiting for him to make a move, to show a sign of weakness. It was as if it knew he was there, that he was a threat to its control over the horde. With his rifle aimed at the leader, Jacob's finger hovered over the trigger. He could take the shot. He could end it all, take down the figure that was controlling the horde and hopefully scatter the zombies. But the uncertainty gnawed at him. If he missed, if the shot didn't kill the leader, he would be right in the heart of the chaos, surrounded by 100 or more undead with nowhere to escape. The leader's eyes flicked toward him again, and this time, there was a shift in its gaze. A sense of recognition, as if it knew Jacob had been debating the move. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It wasn't just aware of him, it was trying to communicate with him, to lure him in, to test his resolve. Jacob's instincts screamed at him to take the shot, but he hesitated. Something wasn't right. He had been a soldier in the old world, trained to analyze situations and think critically under pressure. He had seen countless battles, but this was a whole new level of terror. What was this leader? And what would happen if he destroyed it? Suddenly, the horde shifted. The zombies, once scattered and aimless, began to move again, but this time, they weren't advancing directly toward him. They were circling, forming a widening gap that led to the alley's exit. It was as if they were giving him a choice, a path to escape. But Jacob knew better. This wasn't a gesture of mercy. It was a trap, a carefully orchestrated move to force him into making a choice. The leader was testing him, seeing how far it could push him, how much he would risk. Without warning, the figure took a step forward, its eyes fixed on Jacob. The rest of the horde paused. Jacob's heart raced as the tension between them thickened. He was facing something far more dangerous than a mindless swarm. He was facing a calculated, intelligent adversary, a leader who could command the undead like an army. "Sarah, I need backup, now." Jacob hissed into the earpiece, his voice tight with urgency. "We're almost there, just hang on." Sarah's voice was laced with concern. Jacob could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had to get out, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something huge was about to unfold. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about uncovering the truth behind the undead's evolution, behind the mysterious leader controlling them. As the leader stepped closer, Jacob took a deep breath. There was no going back. He had a mission to complete. And whether he was ready or not, he was about to find out just how far the undead's evolution could go. The tension in the air was suffocating as Jacob watched the leader of the undead take another step toward him. Its eyes, dark, hollow, yet eerily calculating, never left his face. The rest of the horde stood still, as if waiting for a command, their grotesque faces blank, yet somehow unified under the sway of the mysterious figure at the center. Jacob's breath hitched in his throat, and his finger tightened instinctively on the rifle's trigger. But then, something unexpected happened. The leader raised one hand in a slow, deliberate gesture. The horde didn't advance, nor did it retreat. They simply froze, as if anticipating their leader's next move. The silence was deafening, thick with the weight of the moment. It was as though the figure was testing Jacob, gauging his next move. The cold realization hit Jacob, this wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a chess game, and the undead leader was the player, orchestrating each piece with an intelligence he had never thought possible. The mindless hordes he had spent years fighting against were now a distant memory. These zombies were different. They were evolving, adapting. Jacob's heart raced, but his mind remained clear. He had trained for situations like this, battlefields filled with uncertainty, enemies who adapted to every move. But this was something entirely new, and the stakes were higher than ever before. The old rules no longer applied. He slowly lowered his rifle, unwilling to make a move until he understood the full extent of the situation. If he shot now, he might trigger a full-scale attack, forcing him into a situation he wasn't ready for. The figure, this leader, was clearly aware of his presence and the threat he posed. But what was it trying to achieve? Then, like a jolt of electricity through the air, a voice crackled through Jacob's earpiece. It was Sarah, her tone sharp and filled with urgency. "Jacob, listen to me. We've got eyes on you. I don't know what you're facing, but we're moving in from the east. Do not engage. Get to the extraction point. We'll handle it." Jacob's grip tightened again, his pulse quickening as the leader's gaze flickered to the side. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something, satisfaction, perhaps. As if it were pleased to see Jacob hesitating, as if it knew he was torn between the need to act and the desire to understand. The horde didn't move, but Jacob knew the leader was capable of controlling them. If he didn't leave now, he might find himself overwhelmed. The exit was just ahead, but the leader's influence had locked down the entire area, forcing him into a standoff with the undead army. A cold, calculated part of him knew what had to be done. He couldn't afford to waste time. He had no idea how long he had before the horde shifted again. One wrong move could spell disaster, and that was something Jacob couldn't afford. But just as he took a step backward, something shifted in the alley. The leader, without looking, snapped its fingers in a quick, sharp motion. The surrounding zombies, who had been motionless just seconds before, instantly reacted. With terrifying speed, they began to advance toward him. the air hummed with the threat of their movement. Jacob's eyes darted back toward the alley's exit. It was his only chance. He had to move, now. Sarah, now, he growled into his earpiece. In the same instant, the first zombie lunged forward, its mouth gaping wide. Jacob didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the alley's exit, weaving between debris and remnants of the old world, all while keeping a steady eye on the approaching undead. Behind him, the leader stepped forward, raising both hands in a grand, sweeping motion. It was like a conductor commanding its orchestra, and the horde responded in perfect unison. The undead closed the gap, their snarling forms rapidly gaining ground. Jacob's pulse hammered in his ears as he pushed his legs to their limits. He was almost at the exit when the first zombie reached him. It swiped at him with a bony, skeletal arm, but Jacob ducked beneath it, narrowly avoiding the deadly strike. His heart pounded as he pushed forward, the tension in his limbs almost unbearable. He was so close, but the horde was closing in faster than he had anticipated. His foot hit a pile of rubble, causing him to stumble for a split second. It was enough time for the next zombie to reach him, its putrid breath hot against his neck as it lunged. In a desperate move, Jacob spun around, shoving his rifle against the undead's chest. He fired without thinking, the gunshot echoing through the alley as the creature collapsed. But there was no time to celebrate. More were coming. Just as Jacob prepared to make another move, a flash of light appeared ahead of him. The unmistakable hum of an engine pierced the silence. He turned and saw Sarah's vehicle screeching toward him, kicking up dirt and debris in its wake. "Get in!" Sarah shouted through the open window. Jacob didn't wait another second. With one last glance at the leader, whose gaze remained locked on him, Jacob made a run for the vehicle. The moment he jumped into the back seat, Sarah slammed the accelerator to the floor, and they sped off, leaving the horde behind in the dust. As the city faded into the distance, Jacob sat back, his chest heaving. He couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter wasn't over. The leader was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before it made its next move. Jacob knew they had just scratched the surface of something far bigger, something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And whatever it was watching them, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The car bounced over the rough terrain, the tires screeching as Sarah pushed the accelerator to its limits. Jacob's eyes scanned the horizon, his mind still reeling from the encounter with the undead leader. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something far worse than just a swarm of mindless zombies. The world outside the vehicle had become a ghost town. What was once a vibrant city was now a maze of abandoned buildings, broken roads, and the haunting silence of a world lost to the undead. The streets were empty, save for the occasional body of a fallen survivor or a horde lurking in the shadows. Jacob's fingers gripped the seat as he thought back to the leader, the creature that had controlled the horde with such precision. Something about it was different, something far beyond the mindless hunger of the infected. It was as if the zombies were being guided, coordinated like an army. "Sarah, we need to find answers," Jacob said, his voice hoarse from the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins. Sarah didn't look at him as she drove, but she knew what he meant. They had been following leads on the origins of the infection for months, but nothing had prepared them for this. They had always assumed that the undead were the result of a virus, a biological weapon gone wrong, but what Jacob had witnessed was something much more sinister. The leader wasn't just another zombie, it was a force that commanded the undead, like a general leading an army. And if that wasn't enough, it had demonstrated intelligence, the ability to plan and strategize. "I know," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "But we can't just rush in without a plan. We need more intel. I think I know a place, an old military outpost north of here. They might have some information on what's really going on." Jacob nodded, his thoughts still racing. He had to admit, Sarah was right. Charging in blindly could get them killed, but time was running out. The longer they waited, the stronger the undead leader's influence would grow. He could already feel the weight of the decisions ahead, the pressure building in his chest. As they neared the outskirts of the city, a dense fog began to roll in, swallowing up the once familiar landmarks. the eerie silence was broken only by the sound of the engine and the occasional distant growl of zombies. Jacob looked out the window, his eyes scanning the darkness. He had fought through this nightmare for months, but it felt like they were walking into something far worse than anything they had faced before. "Sarah, do you think the leader's just one of many? What if there are others like it?" Jacob asked, voicing his fears aloud. "I don't know, Jacob," she replied, her voice steady, yet filled with uncertainty. "We've seen signs of organization in other parts of the country. Small pockets of resistance from the undead. But this was different. The way it commanded the horde, it's like it had a purpose." Jacob's thoughts turned to the other survivors they had met along the way. Some were barely holding on, barely able to fend off the daily attacks from the zombies. Others, like the ones holed up in the last stronghold, were desperate, clinging to the remnants of a world that no longer existed. And now, they had to face something that no one had prepared for, a leader that could manipulate the undead like puppets on strings. As the vehicle continued its journey, a sudden noise shattered the tense silence. A screeching howl echoed from somewhere deep within the fog. Sarah slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. Jacob's heart skipped a beat as he glanced out the window. There, emerging from the mist, was a horde of zombies, more than he had ever seen in one place, their eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. "They're coming," Sarah whispered, her hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. "What do we do?" Jacob's mind raced as he scanned the surroundings. The fog was thick, and the road was narrow. They couldn't outrun them in the car, not in this fog. They'd be sitting ducks. "We have to get off the road," Jacob said, his voice firm with authority. "Head for the trees. We'll lose them in the cover of the woods." Sarah nodded, her face a mask of determination. She swerved the car off the road and into the dense forest, the tires crunching over the uneven ground. The sound of growls and footsteps grew louder as the horde followed, relentless and unstoppable. The car lurched to a stop in the middle of a small clearing, surrounded by trees that stretched into the fog. Jacob's hand gripped the door handle, ready to make a run for it if the zombies got too close. The vehicle had become a death trap. They couldn't stay here for long. "We need to move, now," Jacob said, his voice urgent. "Head to the cabin. It's not far from here." Sarah didn't hesitate. She threw the car into park and jumped out, her rifle already in hand. Jacob followed suit, grabbing his own weapon and slamming the door behind him. The sounds of the approaching horde echoed in the trees, growing louder with every passing second. They sprinted toward the cabin, weaving through the trees as the fog swallowed them whole. The cabin was small, tucked away in a quiet corner of the woods. It had been abandoned for years, but it would provide the cover they needed. They reached the door and shoved it open, their breathing heavy and quick as they stepped inside. As Sarah slammed the door shut behind them, Jacob's eyes immediately went to the stack of maps on the table. They were close. The answers they needed were just within reach. "I think we're getting closer," Jacob muttered, scanning the maps. "We're heading in the right direction. But we need to find out more about that leader. And how to stop it." As the cabin door rattled, and the sounds of the undead continued to draw near, Jacob and Sarah braced themselves for the next step in their journey. The truth was out there, hidden among the chaos. And they were determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The old cabin creaked and groaned as the wind outside howled through the trees. The rattling of the undead pounding against the door reminded Jacob and Sarah that time was running out. Inside the cabin, the dim light of a flickering lantern cast eerie shadows on the walls. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and that would have to be enough, for now. Jacob's eyes remained fixed on the maps spread across the table in front of him. They had been searching for answers for months, trying to make sense of the chaos that had consumed America. But the more they discovered, the more questions they had. The undead weren't just mindless creatures anymore. Something, or someone, was controlling them, guiding them. And it was getting stronger. "What are we missing?" Jacob muttered, running a hand through his hair. He had a sense of urgency now, a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. They were close to uncovering something huge, but it felt like there was always one step they couldn't quite reach. One piece of the puzzle that kept slipping through their fingers. Sarah, pacing near the window, her rifle slung across her back, finally spoke up. "Jacob, you've been at this for hours. You need to rest. We'll figure it out. But you can't keep pushing yourself like this." He looked up at her, his eyes tired but determined. "I can't rest. Not with what we're up against." His voice was firm, but his words were laced with frustration. "This, leader, whatever it is, it's controlling the undead. It's using them like soldiers. I've never seen anything like it before." Sarah didn't argue. She knew Jacob was right. They'd faced countless waves of zombies, but the leader they had encountered was different. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about control and intelligence guiding the horde with deadly precision. And the worst part? They had no idea how to stop it. The noise outside continued to grow louder. The undead were still close, just outside the cabin, trying to get in. But it wasn't just the zombies they had to worry about anymore. It was the unknown, what lay ahead. What the leader was planning. Jacob's gaze drifted to the stack of military documents on the table. Among the maps were classified reports, some of which had been marked with the words, "Top Secret." He hadn't paid them much attention until now, too focused on the immediate threats. But now, something about them seemed important. Sarah noticed his interest and walked over to the table. She peered over his shoulder as he opened one of the files. It was a series of reports detailing the early days of the outbreak, how it began, how it spread, and the failed attempts to contain it. But there was one section that caught Jacob's attention. "Look at this," Jacob said, pointing to a specific passage in the report. It was dated early on, just after the initial outbreak. "This is from a classified operation. They were experimenting on infected individuals. But it's more than that, they were trying to control them, to weaponize the virus." Sarah frowned, her hand resting on the edge of the table as she read. "Weaponize the undead? How is that even possible?" Jacob's jaw clenched. The military thought they could control the infected, use them as soldiers. But they didn't just infect people. They were trying to harness something inside them, something powerful. Sarah's eyes narrowed as the pieces began to fall into place. "So, the leader, it was one of these experiments? It's been controlling the horde this whole time?" Jacob nodded slowly. "It has to be. This isn't just a mindless infection anymore. It's evolving. The leader we saw wasn't just a zombie, it was the result of an experiment. It's been influencing the others, guiding them with an intelligence that the virus was never supposed to create." "But why?" Sarah asked, her voice soft with disbelief. "Why would they do this?" "I don't know," Jacob admitted. "But whatever they were trying to do, it didn't work. The virus spread. The experiments failed. And now, we're dealing with the fallout. That leader we saw? It's the result of all of this. And it's learning. Evolving." The realization hit both of them at the same time. The undead were no longer a simple threat. They were part of something much bigger, something the military had never intended. The leader was the product of years of twisted experimentation, and now, it was out of control. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the door. The undead had begun their assault, pushing against the cabin with relentless force. It was only a matter of time before the door gave way. Jacob and Sarah exchanged a quick glance. "We don't have much time," Jacob said, grabbing his rifle from the corner. "We need to figure out a way to stop this leader, before it gets worse." Sarah nodded, her face hardening. "We need to find out where it's coming from. We need to take the fight to them." With that, the two of them readied their weapons and prepared to move out. The truth about the undead was darker than they had imagined, and the leader was just the beginning. There was more at play here than they could have ever known, and the battle for humanity's survival was far from over. As the undead pressed harder against the cabin door, Jacob and Sarah knew they were about to face the most dangerous challenge of their lives. They were up against something that had been created by the very people who were supposed to protect them. And now, that very creation was hunting them down, one step closer to total domination. But they weren't going down without a fight. The cabin shuddered as another heavy blow struck the door. Jacob's heart raced as he slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle, the sound echoing through the small room. The undead outside were relentless, but there was something more terrifying than their numbers, the feeling that time was slipping through their fingers. Sarah glanced out of the cabin's small window, her breath fogging up the glass. The undead weren't just mindless creatures anymore, they were organized, and with each passing moment, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. They had uncovered the truth about the military's experiments, but now, the full weight of their discovery pressed down on them. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting to stop an enemy far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. "Jacob, they're getting closer," Sarah said, her voice tense. "We can't stay here much longer." He looked at her, his mind racing. The map they had uncovered in the cabin's files seemed to offer a possible lead, a military facility in the nearby mountains. If the leader was truly the result of an experiment, then the answers had to be there. But getting there meant passing through hordes of undead, possibly facing the leader itself. The danger was unprecedented. "We don't have much of a choice," Jacob replied. "We need to go to the facility. It's our best shot at stopping this thing once and for all." Sarah nodded, though the worry in her eyes was hard to miss. She was used to fighting, but even she could feel the enormity of the task ahead. As they prepared to leave, the door buckled under another assault. It wouldn't hold for long. They needed a way out, and fast. "We'll have to go out the back," Jacob said, pointing to a small door leading into the dense woods behind the cabin. "It'll be a tight squeeze, but if we move fast, we can lose them in the trees." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her gear and moved toward the back door, Jacob right behind her. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit them like a shock to the system. The fog was thick, obscuring their vision, but it worked to their advantage. The horde outside the cabin was still hammering away at the door, oblivious to their escape. They ran, the ground soft underfoot as they navigated the thick forest. Jacob's senses were heightened, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, put him on edge. They weren't alone, and every step forward was a gamble. "There's a clearing up ahead," Sarah said, pointing into the fog. "We'll stop there and regroup." Jacob nodded, and they pushed through the trees, reaching the clearing in minutes. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. But they didn't have much time to appreciate the view. The undead were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they were either dead or overrun. Jacob dropped to his knees, pulling out a small set of binoculars. He scanned the area, looking for any signs of danger. In the distance, he could make out the faint outline of a building, tall, fortified, and surrounded by a wall. It was the military facility they had seen on the map. But between them and their destination lay a horde of undead, moving like a living wave in the fog. "We're not getting through that without a fight," Sarah muttered, watching the mass of zombies. The horde had followed them into the forest, their growls and groans growing louder as they neared. Jacob's mind worked quickly, formulating a plan. They had one chance to make it to the facility, and it wasn't going to be easy. But it was their only shot. "We're going to make a run for it," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. "We'll cut through the trees and use the fog to cover our movements. It's going to be a mess, but we'll make it." Sarah gave him a look, a mixture of concern and trust. "We don't have any other choice." "Exactly," Jacob replied. "Let's move." They slipped into the forest again, moving as quietly as possible. The fog provided them with some cover, but they knew it wouldn't last. The undead were closing in, their low growls growing louder with every passing second. As they approached the edge of the clearing, a sudden screech pierced the air. Jacob's heart stopped. He turned just in time to see a large, grotesque figure emerge from the fog, a creature far more twisted than any zombie they had encountered. It was the leader, and it was looking directly at them. "Run!" Jacob shouted, his voice filled with panic. They had no time to fight. They had to get to the facility, and they had to do it now. The leader let out a terrifying scream, and the horde surged forward, breaking into a chaotic chase. Jacob and Sarah bolted through the trees, their breath ragged as they pushed themselves harder than ever before. The sound of the undead pounding behind them spurred them forward, their survival instincts kicking in. As they neared the facility, they could see the fortified gates in the distance. But the undead were closing in fast, and the leader was right behind them. With every step, the terror of being caught seemed more real. There was no room for mistakes. "We're almost there," Sarah shouted, her voice full of hope. Jacob's eyes were fixed on the gates. The facility was within reach, but so was the horde. They had seconds, just seconds, to make it through the gates before they were overtaken. They reached the gates, and Jacob slammed his hand against the buzzer. The sound of the mechanism unlocking was like music to their ears. The gates creaked open just wide enough for them to slip through, and they dove inside, collapsing onto the cold concrete. As the gates slammed shut behind them, they were safe, at least for now. But the leader, the terrifying force that had been controlling the undead, was still out there, and they had no idea what horrors lay ahead. But one thing was clear, they had made it this far, and they would fight to the end. They were the last warriors standing, and they weren't going down without a fight. The gates of the military facility creaked shut behind them with a heavy, resounding thud, blocking out the snarls of the undead just moments before they could reach them. Inside, the cold concrete walls offered only temporary respite. Jacob and Sarah stood, breathless and bloodied from their narrow escape, their eyes fixed on the dark corridors stretching ahead. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the facility, though they couldn't tell if it was the enemy or something worse, something they hadn't yet seen. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "We're inside. But now what? We've got no backup, no supplies, and the undead," she paused, looking over at Jacob. "The leader is out there, and it's only getting smarter." Jacob nodded grimly, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "We need to get to the central control room. The map we found earlier shows it's located somewhere in the heart of this facility. If we can find out more about these experiments, we might have a chance to stop it." Sarah set her jaw. "You really think there's something in there that can help us? Something to kill that thing?" "There has to be," Jacob said, pulling his rifle tight against his chest. "They were working on the virus here. They might have figured out how to weaponize it or even contain it." With no time to waste, they began to move through the facility's hallways, every creak and groan of the building echoing through the empty corridors. They passed abandoned offices, shattered windows, and broken equipment that looked like it had been hastily abandoned. The walls were streaked with dried blood, remnants of the failed experiments, the battles fought and lost by those who had tried to contain the outbreak. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed down the hallway. Jacob's heart skipped a beat as the unmistakable sound of something large and heavy stumbling toward them filled the air. His instincts kicked in, and he motioned for Sarah to take cover behind a nearby pillar. From the shadows, the leader emerged, a grotesque figure wrapped in tattered military fatigues. It was no longer just a mindless, decaying corpse. The creature had evolved, its skin stretched tight over muscles that seemed unnaturally strong. Its eyes, now glowing with an eerie intelligence, locked onto Jacob and Sarah as it let out a low growl. "We're too late," Sarah muttered, her voice thick with disbelief. Jacob didn't answer. He didn't need to. He raised his rifle, taking aim at the leader's head. But before he could pull the trigger, the leader lunged, faster than either of them expected, slamming into Jacob and sending him sprawling to the floor. Sarah reacted instantly, firing a few shots that distracted the creature long enough for Jacob to scramble back to his feet. But the leader was relentless. It moved like a predator, using its newfound intelligence to anticipate their every move. It wasn't just stronger, it was faster, smarter, and more dangerous than anything they had faced before. "Keep moving!" Jacob shouted, as Sarah fired another shot at the leader. This time, it barely flinched, its glowing eyes never leaving them. "We need to get to the control room." The leader charged again, this time grabbing Sarah by the arm. It lifted her effortlessly, throwing her across the hallway into a stack of broken crates. She crashed to the ground with a grunt, but she didn't stay down for long. The leader was closing in on her, its monstrous form towering over her like a shadow. "Sarah!" Jacob yelled, rushing toward her. But before he could reach her, the leader turned its attention back to him, sensing his movement. It was too much. Too fast. But just as the creature lunged at Jacob, a new sound pierced the air, louder and more thunderous than the leader's growls. A mechanical whirring filled the space, followed by the hum of heavy doors sliding open. The control room doors burst open with a sudden force, and the flashing red lights of an emergency alert illuminated the hallway. Jacob's mind raced. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. The room was their only hope. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the control room, the leader hot on their heels. As they reached the threshold, Jacob slammed the door shut just as the leader pounded against it, its claws scraping against the reinforced steel. Inside the control room, they quickly began scanning the terminals, their hands moving frantically over the buttons and screens. Jacob's heart pounded as he searched for the data they needed. "There has to be something here," he muttered. Sarah glanced at the screen, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Jacob, this is it." She pointed at the data on the screen. "This is the project they were working on, the experiments, the virus, everything. It's all here." Jacob leaned in, his mind absorbing the information. They were creating an army of these things. Not just to control them, but to make them stronger, smarter, more deadly. His eyes narrowed. "And if we don't stop it here, they'll spread. This virus won't just wipe out the country, it'll wipe out the world." A voice echoed in the darkness behind them. "You really think you can stop it?" The leader's voice was distorted, but there was no mistaking the mocking tone. Jacob turned toward the door. The leader was inside the control room now, its massive form filling the doorway. But this time, it wasn't the same. This wasn't just a mindless creature, it was a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. But Jacob wasn't afraid anymore. He had what they needed. The virus, the answers, everything. "Let's finish this," he said, gripping his rifle. The final confrontation had arrived. The last warriors stood between humanity's survival and complete annihilation. And this battle, this last fight, was their only chance to save what was left of the world. As the doors to the control room slammed open, Jacob and Sarah stepped into the unknown, ready to face the leader and whatever horrors awaited them. One thing was clear, they were going to fight to the bitter end. And they wouldn't go down without a fight. End of Part 8 and final chapter. In this conclusion, Jacob and Sarah make their final stand in the military facility, uncovering the full extent of the experiments and the deadly virus that has ravaged the world. The leader, now more terrifying and intelligent than ever, stands in their way as they attempt to end the nightmare once and for all. The suspense and tension reach their peak, leaving the audience on the edge of their seats as the final battle for humanity's future unfolds.